Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Pointy Not Sharp. Today we're taking a look at the Australian L1A2 bayonet. Now I have done a previous video on this bayonet, and that was actually the first video I ever did on this channel. But I've got a lot more information now, and I thought it could do with a little bit of a touch up. So the L1A2 was made to fit a number of different weapons. So initially it was designed for the L1A1 or SLR. That's a rifle that has a lot of different names. So officially it's the L1A1. The soldiers called it the SLR. The factory called it the 7.62. And during the entire development process, it was referred to as the FN. This bayonet will also fit the F1 submachine gun, and it'll also fit the heavy barrel L2A1 as well, which is just a heavy barrel version of the L1A1 or SLR. Now, these bayonets were made at the Lithgow Small Arms Factory between 1958 to, they say 1984, but I've got records that they still produced a couple after that as well, so it's not entirely clear. From what I can tell, based on some records I've got, there was 253,512 weapons made that took this bayonet. So that's 222,773 L1A1s, 21,182 F1s, and 9,557 L1A2s. L2A1s. And I'm assuming that each one of these weapons had a bayonet made to go with it, but I've got no way to tell. So this is just a guess. I'm going off the number of weapons made. Now we'll jump into a little bit of history first. In the early 1950s, the British were looking at a self-loading rifle, and initially they were looking at the EM2, which was their own proprietary rifle and their own cartridge. That was really cool because that's a bullpup. I'm actually trying to get hands on a bayonet for that at the moment, so hopefully I've got a video coming up for that. But while it went pretty well, the US bullied them into adopting the 7.62 NATO cartridge, and they ended up going with the FNFAL, or at least they started the trials in like the mid-50s, and they called that the X2E1. So while the British were using the X2E1 in trials, so were a number of Commonwealth countries, including Canada and Australia. And they came with like an FAL Type 1 bayonet with the flash hider on the crossguard. And interestingly enough, Australia actually deployed soldiers during the Malayan emergency from the 2nd Battalion, or 2RAR, in 1956 with those experimental or trials rifles, and they were pretty well liked. Now, throughout this trial, the British were trialling a range of different bayonets as well, and they really liked this style of blade here, which was what they had on the number 5 and number 9 bayonets. They weren't too fond of the FNFAL Type 1 bayonet. So they developed their own trials bayonets to fit the FN, and they called those the X4E1 bayonets. And they're pretty much identical to what we have here. There were just some minor differences amongst them, and two of them were decided upon or approved at the end of the trial, and that was the L1A1 and L1A2. So the British adopted the L1A1, which is almost identical to what we have here, except the pommel is brazed and heat shrunk onto the tang. Whether in the L1A2, we've got two small rivets which are ground down flush, so you can barely even see them. You have to look really close and at the right angle to be able to see them. There they are. So Canada and Australia adopted the L1A2 bayonet, which is what we have here. The Canadians called theirs the C1, and that was a little bit different. And I've actually got one here to show you, so you can really see the difference. So externally, they look the same. Frog's a little bit different. It's Nolan frog. But then when you pull it out, the blade is in the white, whether here we've got a heavily blued or parkerized blade. They also have a square fuller, whether the Australian ones usually have a round fuller. I'll get into that shortly. And they're also marked with the Canadian Arsenal stamp, the C with an A inside, and then date of manufacture. This one's a 1966. So that's how you tell them apart. I'll put that to the side. So production started in 1958, and they were first delivered with the rifles, obviously, on the 1st of March 1959. They had a formal acceptance parade on the 5th of March 1959, where 2RAR, the 2nd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, I believe they had one platoon with the SLR, one platoon with the SMLE, and they had like a passing of the guard kind of thing, and the SMLE sort of marched off into the distance and marched off into the retreat, and the SLR marched forward, and that was the parade. And they were initially issued to 1RAR and 3RAR, who both saw use of them in the Malayan emergency, so they were put to use straight away. They were also initially used in training units to train up the next generation of soldiers in the new generation of weapons. So, a little bit of background for you. I actually served quite a number of years in 3RAR, which is sort of like the premier battalion, if you will. They certainly were when I went through. We were paratroopers back then, and we like to think we trained to a higher standard than everyone else, but whatever. Also did a year in 1RAR, and when I was in 1RAR, 2RAR were our mortal enemies, and they have a slogan, second to none. I don't know how many times I saw a big sign that had out the front of their unit, second to none, vandalised, to second to one. 1, 2, and 3RAR were the first three battalions made at the conclusion of World War II, so it's pretty much all of our full-time infantry. Since then we got a number of other battalions as well, all the way up to 8, 9. It's got a lot of different battalions. 1, 2, and 3, when I was in the army, were like the premier battalions, because they were light infantry and they were held to a higher standard than the others, which were mechanised and motorised. Not the case anymore. Now they're all mechanised and motorised. It's a shame. Anyway, by June 1959, 1,200 rifles had been put together, so not too many, but eventually they got production up to about 750 rifles and bayonets per month. And New Zealand actually ordered 15,000 rifles and bayonets, and this was a bit funny because it contradicted the New Zealand Defence Ministry, who only wanted weapons that were British made, and they had to settle for something that was Australian made. So odd that they did that. Anyway, they saw a bit of use in the Malayan emergency, a little bit more in the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation, and they saw a lot of use in Vietnam. So in Vietnam, Australian soldiers were absolutely using the SLR and the L1A2 bayonet, as well as other rifles like the M16. In 1988, the SLR and L1A2 bayonet were replaced by the F88 and the M7 and M9 bayonets. Well, initially it wasn't replaced by the M7 and M9. Initially it was replaced by the KCB 77, and then that was replaced by the M7 and M9 very, very quickly. I've done a previous video on that. Check it out. There were trials with the F88 where they had a L1A2 style of bayonet adapted to fit the F88, but or the Steyr as they called it at the time. But they ended up choosing the KCB 77 over that. I don't know why, because the blade on this it's very nice. Like, it's a bit small for my hand. I have a pretty big hand, but the blade's very nice. If you get a decent edge on that, that's good to go. Anyway, we'll jump into the construction. So there are 12 different variations to this bayonet that I've heard of. There's probably a lot more that have been found since. There's a whole bunch of minor bits and pieces that are a bit different about them, and I've got a couple of examples here to show you today. These are all Australian L1A2s. Pull them out so you can see. And they look pretty much the same. Slight difference in the finishes, but it's not too big a deal. So we'll start with the blade profile. As I previously said, that is a number 5 style, which is also the same as the British number 9. They brought the tip in just a little bit because it was found to be a little bit fragile. Now, the first variations of these bayonets, made between 1958 and 1960, have a square fuller, like we have here. I say square, it's not quite a square, but it's got a squared edge to it. And those were only the first 2 years of manufacture. In 1960, they started making them with a rounded fuller, like we have here. And the rounded fuller, the Australian L1A2, is the only version of this style of bayonet with a rounded fuller. So if you find one with a rounded fuller and no markings, it's an L1A2. I forgot to mention earlier when I was filming that some of the really early examples of this bayonet also had a two-tone blade,
where it was only parkerized or blued approximately 3/4 of an inch up the blade, but it's really not clear how many will like this. I've heard some people say for the first 1 or 2 months of production, but doesn't appear so.
They also have like a parkerized finish, although these have all been worn down a little bit, so they don't have that sort of sandy feel to them anymore. And quite a few of them were finished with black paint as well, but I don't believe this was done at the factory. I believe this was done at Unit 4 Parade. So this one here is a good example of that. We've got a black finish or a black paint on the handle and a little bit on the blade as well. Now there's two variations to the tips. There is those with a long point and those with a short point. I've only got 3 long ones here, unfortunately, to show you. I don't have a short one. And I've heard a couple of different reasons for that. So I've heard that the long ones were better for stabbing, but prone to snapping. So they were held in reserve for like deployments and operational use. And the short ones were primarily used in training. I find that pretty credible. Also, there's a difference in the inspection slots. So if you're not familiar with inspection slots, they are this little straight hole down here. Now the Canadian ones, you can spot them because their inspection slot is shaped like a T, if you can make that out. Whether the Australian ones are all straight. Now I haven't found any source outlining exactly why, but at some point during production, and it's on both of my early productions and not my later production, they did away with the inspection slot. We also have a slight difference between the Australian scabbards and the British one. So I'll move the bayonets out of the way and I'll show you the scabbards. So as you can see here, the Australian Lithgow scabbard has quite a sharp and straight taper to it. Whether the British ones, I don't know if you can see it, it is quite fine, are a bit more rounded. So the shape is a little bit different. And then the Canadian ones are sort of a mixture of the two. So I don't know how well you can see that on camera, but the Australian ones have a very sharp edge to them. The Canadian ones are still sharp, but a little bit rounded, and the British ones are quite rounded. In terms of the actual frogs, so even though this one's a bit ratty, this is sort of like the standard frog for the L1A2. And then they also made one with a, I forget what you call them, the US clips for their belts. So with the US style webbing. And it's very common to see these frogs painted black for parade use as well. Now there are a couple other variations to this bayonet that you come across. So I'll just pull one into frame so you can have a look at one. You come across them completely chromed for drill use or ceremonial parade use. And they're still in use today with the Australian Federal Guard, the Australian New South Wales Police Force. I assume other police forces and correctional forces around the country as well likely use them. And from what I can tell, they weren't chromed in the factory. They were individually chromed by units. So these days they don't make them anymore. They have to find them secondhand and get them chromed up. And often when they chrome them up, they also get a plastic tip that goes over the end that's still in the shape of the blade with like a little circle at the end, so they don't go around stabbing each other on ceremonial parades. The other variation you come across is the sectionized one. Now the sectionized one, the bayonet is identical. They only sectionize the scabbard. And the particular pattern that they do in the sectionizing of the scabbard is the same that the British do with their L1A1s, L1A3s, and L1A4s. So it seems to be pretty universal. Now, I don't know how many sectionized ones were made, but I've come across like 7 or 8 so far, so I assume quite a number were made. I have no idea at all. You also come across these occasionally with custom paint on them. I know some of the diggers who served in parts of the country that were very, very red, like in the desert, put red paint on them because it was fantastic camouflage. And finally, we'll talk about the markings. So out of the factory, these have no markings on them whatsoever. That's how you know that it's a proper L1A2. You will come across the occasional one with like a British stock number on the handle, and that's one where the handle has been replaced with one from a L1A3 or L1A4. I've seen a couple others with numbers stamped in the pommel and things like that. I don't know when or who did this. Maybe it's a rack number or something like that. And I have seen one with an SASR, or Australian SAS, squadron number stamped up here, but I've spoken to some members from the SASR who served with these bayonets, and they can't recall anyone ever marking them or them being marked in the unit, so I dare say that was done privately after the fact. Anyway, guys, that's all I have to say about the L1A2 bayonet. Most of the information that I've come up with today comes from Ian Skennington and Robert Richards' book, British and Commonwealth Bayonets, as well as this one here, Lithgow's Small Arms Factory and Its People, Volume 2, 1950 to 1990, by Tony Griffiths. This is an absolutely fantastic book. You can buy it from the Small Arms Factory website. I went out there in person and got a copy, and have not regretted it. 99% of the book is the history and what's going on at the time. So like you'll have like what the cricket team was up to in 1965 and stuff like that, information that you really don't care about. But then you come across these occasional tables that show you how many rifles were made, like across what year, and just some absolutely fantastic information. So stuff like that. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got to say, and thanks for watching.